Greetings, this is Greg. The SPAD XIII was the best French fighter of the First World War. It's not only the best French fighter, but it's in the running for best World War I fighter, period. I don't think it's possible to say which fighter of the period was the best. There are just too many contenders for that title. From the German side alone, we have three: the Fokker D7, the D8, at least once its wings were fixed, and the Siemens-Schuckert D4. From the British side, you could argue for at least three airplanes as well, but the SPAD XIII is as good as any of them. It was faster than any German fighter, rugged, a stable gun platform, and had a high dive speed. It was also comparatively easy to fly and had some really nice features for the pilot. The SPAD was flown by the French ace of aces, René Fonck. He was not only the top French and Allied ace of World War I, he is the all-time Allied ace of aces, including all wars. Officially, he shot down 75 aircraft, putting him just behind the 80 victories of Germany's Red Baron. However, we need to consider that most of the air war was taking place on the German side of the lines, making kill confirmations much easier for the Germans. The Red Baron would try very hard to get kill confirmations. As far as I can tell, René Fonck didn't really do that, not that he could anyway, with most of the wreckages being behind enemy lines. The SPAD XIII was also flown by the French ace Guillemer, an ace we don't hear about much today, but he was one of the greatest and at one time was quite well known. He was very popular in France. There's a statue there in his honor. He was on a stamp and more. In popular U.S. culture, he is mentioned in the Twilight Zone episode, The Last Flight, which is a great episode, and it's how I learned to pronounce Guillemer, so if you have a problem with that, take it up with Rod Serling. I would also argue that Guillemer was indirectly mentioned in the movie The Great Waldo Pepper. In that movie, the title character discussed a fight with Ernst Kessler, a fictional character, but one very clearly based on the real German ace Ernst Udet. That discussion is clearly talking about the actual battle between the real Ernst Udet against Guillemer. The short version is they fought to a draw. As for the SPAD XIII, it wasn't only flown by the French. The leading Italian ace, Francesco Baracca, also flew one. His SPAD was adorned with a black prancing horse. If that sounds familiar to you, it's because the Baracca family gave a young racing driver permission to use the same symbol on his race cars. Today, it's one of the most famous logos in racing. You might have seen it. I have mugs for sale in my ongoing effort to avoid sponsors on this channel. I commissioned the artwork from Spacer. His contact information, as well as links to my World War I aircraft mugs, are in the video description. Spacer elected to go with a SPAD in an Italian paint scheme, which I think looks really good on this airplane. The mugs can be found in different orientations for left or right-handed people, different colors for the lining, or without the text, and a myriad of options. Just click around to customize it. Back to our video. The SPAD XIII was also flown by U.S. ace Frank Luke. He used the plane in a very aggressive manner, and in only 10 days shot down 14 balloons and 4 airplanes before his death. It's ironic considering his level of risk-taking, but he died almost from a fluke. It was from a German bullet fired from a hilltop about a mile away, not from the intensive high-caliber anti-aircraft fire defending the balloons he was attacking. The list of aces who flew this airplane is extensive. I suppose I should mention Eddie Rickenbacker, who is usually considered the leading World War I ace from the United States with 26 victories. I'm hesitant to agree that Rickenbacker is the highest scoring U.S. World War I ace, or that he had 26 victories. There were some unusual standards for kill confirmations in play here, and if you apply the same standard to everyone, and consider U.S. pilots who were flying for the British, which are normally ignored for some reason, Rickenbacker isn't even in the top 5 U.S. aces of World War I. At least that's the way I see it. I suppose it would take an entire video to really get into that, and frankly, I'm not sure it's worth the time or even the right type of topic for this channel. Back to our main subject. SPAD is an acronym which translates to Society for Aviation and its Derivatives. In 1916, they released the SPAD VII, which was probably the best fighter in the sky that year. The SPAD VII was rugged, easy to fly, pretty fast, and had no real problems. A big part of the reason the SPAD VII was so good was its Hispano-Suiza engine. This was a liquid-cooled V8 with 150 horsepower. However, as time marched on, the SPAD VII needed upgrades in power to stay ahead of the German fighters. Power was increased to 170 horsepower, but it needed even more. Eventually, they got 180 horsepower out of this engine via an increase in the compression ratio from 4.72 to 1 to 5.33 to 1, a big increase, and 5.33 to 1 was considered pretty high at the time with the fuels they had available. They also added a larger carburetor, which had the effect of allowing for more manifold pressure and increased the ignition timing by almost 5 degrees. These 180 horsepower engines were put into SPAD VIIs in early 1917, and by April of that year became the standard production engine, but still more power was needed, and they had hit a wall at 180 horsepower. This was the first of two problems that led to the SPAD XIII. Remember Guinmer, the French ace we mentioned earlier? Well, he really wanted a 37mm cannon on his airplane. I don't know what it is about that caliber, 37mm, but during the interwar period, there was a lot of interest in using it in aircraft, so much so that every major participant in the Second World War fielded aircraft armed with 37mm cannons. The Soviets stuck with this size on fighter planes through much of the Cold War. Again, I don't know what it is about that caliber. That's a question for a gun channel. But the aviation interest in it appears to have started with Guinmer. Guinmer corresponded with the head designer at SPAD, someone he corresponded with quite frequently. That gentleman then got to work on this project. Now, a 37mm cannon is big, it's heavy, and requires a strong mounting point. This is a picture of the specific type they wanted to use being operated by U.S. soldiers. On the SPAD VII, there really isn't a good spot to mount this thing. Perhaps with a lot of strengthening, you could mount one in a pod on the wing, but at a huge sacrifice in performance. There just isn't any good way to do this without designing a whole new airplane. Furthermore, the SPAD VII needed more power, but as I mentioned, was already maxed out in terms of compression, carburation, and timing. They had, in effect, hit a wall at 180 horsepower. Both of these problems were solved via a gear reduction drive between the engine and propeller. This allowed the engine to rev higher, but without overspeeding the prop, giving a full 200 horsepower. They also added in a taller intake manifold, probably giving some tunnel ram effect. Quick side note, tunnel rams are tall intake manifolds, great for power, but usually a problem for packaging. In the case of the Hispano, the taller manifold probably added some power, but was there mainly to allow for the barrel of the 37mm cannon to fit in the middle of the V and fire through the propeller hub, as that hub was now relocated above the crankshaft centerline. As a side note, weapons firing through the prop hub was a common thing in World War II, and this is exactly how they did it. It's a common misconception that they were firing through a hollow crankshaft. That's false. They do this by relocating the prop hub via a gear drive and putting the cannon aft of the engine with the barrel in the middle of the V firing through the now offset spinner. As far as I know, that all started here with the SPAD. If you like historical aircraft, please like and subscribe to this channel. Also, consider joining my Patreon. Members there have a direct line of communication with me and get to vote in polls helping to determine the direction of this channel. In fact, this video and an earlier one on the Albatross are direct results of my polls on Patreon. There you can also find the documents I use to make these videos. That includes NASA's Quest for Performance and a 570-page aircraft engine book from 1921 that I'm using for this video, and all of this is in PDF form and generally high-quality scans. Back to our story. Of course, with the prop centerline moved up relative to the crankshaft, the engine had to be placed lower in the fuselage to put the prop drive in the right spot. Then the fuselage had to be further modified to fit that cannon, and of course there had to be reinforcements. By the time all that's done, you have what is really a new fuselage. Next, you're going to want more wing area to carry the extra weight, so you make new wings with improvements in construction that the rapidly moving aviation industry has allowed. At this point, you have a SPAD with 220 horsepower and a 37mm cannon, but it's not really a SPAD VII anymore. It's an all-new airplane. It's the SPAD XII. Well, the SPAD XII didn't really work out. Nobody knows how many were built, but it was at most a few dozen. This is one here. You can tell it's a 12 by the struts connecting the fuselage to the upper wing. Pictures of these are often mistaken for SPAD XIIIs because they look very similar. The problem with the 37mm cannon was that it was a single-shot weapon. The pilot had to reload it after every shot, something difficult to do while flying an airplane, let alone while flying an airplane in combat. It also filled the cockpit up with fumes and smoke every time it was fired. It quickly proved to be very unpopular with pilots. At this point, they gave up on the big cannon and on firing through the propeller hub, although again, both of these ideas would come back in a big way between the First and Second World War and would be fairly prominent in World War II. They just didn't work out in the SPAD XII. Fortunately, the SPAD XIII was ready to take its place. The 13 had slightly more wing area than the 12 and featured twin 7.7 millimeter Vickers machine guns, replacing the 37 millimeter cannon. The machine guns were conventionally mounted on top of the cowling and synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. As with the SPAD XII, the 13 had 220 horsepower, although in some cases only 200. The 200 horsepower engines had lower compression, and I've never seen an explanation as to why they didn't equip all the SPAD 13s with the 220 horse engine. It's not like it cost more. It could have been a logistical thing. They may have had a surplus of 200 horsepower engines already built, or perhaps the lower powered engines were more reliable, thus more desirable for some situations. Either way, the SPAD 13 still had a minimum of 200 horsepower, which was a lot, and it was fast. It first flew in April of 1917 and started showing up in squadrons the next month. Initially, production was slow but ramped up, and by the end of the war, nearly every French and U.S. fighter squadron was flying this type. We need to talk more about that engine, the Hispano-Suiza 8B, as it was truly ahead of its time. It's a 90-degree V8 displacing 718 cubic inches, or 11.78 liters. That might sound huge, but by aircraft engine standards, especially at that time, it's really not. The Albatros D3 was powered by a six-cylinder engine that was much larger, at 14.78 liters. The Hispano was relatively lightweight for the amount of power it makes, which is an important attribute in aircraft engines. For comparison, the Hispano 8 engines generally weighed around 450 pounds dry, meaning without the radiator coolant and oil. The Mercedes engine in the Albatros series of fighters is up around 680 pounds dry. It's often thought that air-cooled rotary engines were super light, but the Sopwith-Campbell's Clerget 9B had far less power, only 150 horsepower, and weighed 381 pounds. Sure, it's a bit lighter, but in terms of pounds of weight per horsepower, the Clerget rotary is way behind the Hispano V8. Yes, the radiator and coolant would close that gap some, but the point is that even compared with the air-cooled rotaries, the Hispano was pretty darn light by standards of the day. One of the best features of the Hispano was the way everything was closed up and sealed on it so it didn't throw oil all over the place. It had valve covers preventing the rocker arms and valve mechanisms from throwing out oil. Today that seems like an obvious thing to do, and all modern engines are built that way. But it was uncommon in World War I aero engines. Most of the German airplanes and most other Allied airplanes used engines that threw out huge quantities of oil, which was a constant headache for the pilot, who was always having to wipe oil off of his goggles, the windscreen, and everything else. The SPAD wasn't like that. The designers of the SPAD also ran the exhaust back so that it exited just aft of the pilot. That's another thing that seems like something a designer should obviously do. But back then, few planes were set up that way. Even the mighty Fokker D7, the plane most seem to argue was the best fighter of the war, was set up so that the pilot would breathe in exhaust and oil all the time. When reading about the SPAD, I always hear the same positive attributes over and over. It was fast, could dive well, was rugged, and it was a stable gun platform. All of these things are true, but I think they tend to miss one of the SPAD's most important advantages. It was a relatively pilot-friendly airplane. I think it was the first World War I fighter to consider what we would call today human factors. Not only was the pilot relatively free of exhaust fumes and oil, the cockpit was laid out pretty well. The radiator control was in the cockpit and operated by the pilot's left hand. Compare that to the Albatros, which required the pilot to switch hands on the control stick and then reach outside the cockpit and manipulate it with his right hand. The SPAD's controls and gauges were pretty well located by World War I standards. The airspeed indicator was on the instrument panel, which seems like an obvious place to put it. But on German planes, it was usually out on a wing strut far away from the pilot, very difficult to see and read. When on final approach to landing, there are generally two things the pilot of an aircraft from this era needs to look at: airspeed and the runway. When one of these two things is 90 degrees off of the other, it complicates the pilot's job, especially when we're talking about the relatively inexperienced pilots that were flying these things in World War I. I have also read a U.S. test pilot's notes that said the SPAD's cockpit was relatively warm. That makes sense because although, like other World War I fighters, there was no heater in the SPAD's open cockpit, the pilot's legs were in aluminum tunnels just below the engine. Heat passes right through aluminum. It's a terrible insulator, and when you need to keep your legs warm in the freezing temperatures, that's a big plus as it lets that engine heat right through. I'm sure they used aluminum because it was light and also resistant to fuel, oil, and coolant, all the things that could spill on it. Pilot comfort was probably an unplanned side benefit. I'm going to make a quick detour here off topic. People often assume aluminum is only used because it's light. That's not true. There are a lot of applications where it's the thermal conductivity of aluminum that's the reason for its use. This is true in radiators and intercoolers. If heat couldn't get through the metal, they wouldn't work. If you make a radiator entirely out of stainless steel, it would not only be heavy, you would need such a large radiator that it would be impractical. Stainless steel is a good insulator, great for a firewall because it doesn't let the heat through, opposite of aluminum. If you want to know more about this concept, look up coefficient of thermal conductivity. Back to our story. The only real oddity in the SPAD XIII was that the pilot would have to deal with the unusual propeller rotation, which was counterclockwise as viewed from the rear. In most aircraft, including the SPAD VII, it was clockwise. This was because of the SPAD XIII's gear drive system. It allowed for higher engine RPM and thus more power, but also reversed the direction of the prop. That meant an inexperienced pilot could be caught off guard by the opposite asymmetrical propeller forces. I don't think this was a big problem, and I do have personal experience with flying and doing flight instruction in airplanes with what I'll call reverse rotation props. And I found that most experienced prop plane pilots adjust for it almost automatically and without much thought. However, we need to remember that pilots in World War I were incredibly inexperienced by modern standards, so this may have caught some newer pilots off guard and on occasion contributed to a takeoff accident. I don't know that it did, I'm just speculating. It's interesting to notice the SPAD's exhaust tips. It looks like this was an early attempt to increase the jet thrust from the exhaust. There are also louvers in the exhaust pipes to let exhaust escape if the pressure builds up, which is interesting. If you imagine yourself flying a World War I airplane, with all the misery that comes with that, the cold, breathing in exhaust, and castor oil, the SPAD starts to look like a really attractive option. The pilot of a SPAD XIII will be much less miserable than he would be in a lot of other fighters. Plus, with the plane's speed, he has the confidence of knowing he can escape danger if needed and will often be able to choose which fights to engage in. Being able to avoid an obviously losing fight is a big plus if you're trying to stay alive. The SPAD wasn't particularly maneuverable. It certainly wasn't going to outturn an albatross. But if I had to go to war in one, heck, if I just had to fly one from, say, Tulsa to Oklahoma City, I'm taking the SPAD every time. At the end of that flight, I'll be relaxing at the airport restaurant getting a burger while the albatross pilot will be making an emergency visit to the restroom due to all the castor oil he ingested during the flight. I mentioned the SPAD XIII was fast. The 200 horsepower version could top out at 130 miles per hour at 6,500 feet, and with 220 horsepower, it could reach 134. This is a chart from a NASA book showing various World War I fighters. Was the SPAD XIII the fastest plane of the war? Technically, no. The French Newport Delage biplane was faster, but too late to see combat during the First World War. It did have success as a race plane, which is what you see pictured here, and it did go into some combat in the 1920s. The British had the Martinsyde Buzzard, packing a 300 horsepower version of the Hispano-Suiza 8. They were able to make that thing more and more powerful as time went on. So this thing was fast, and it did enter service during the war, but I don't think any saw combat. Over in Italy, they had the Ansaldo A1, also faster than the SPAD XIII, but a late entry with very little success. The few Ansaldos in service managed to shoot down only one single enemy aircraft. So in practical terms, considering frontline aircraft that mattered, the only one that was as fast or faster than the SPAD XIII was the British SC-5A, and then it depends on what versions you're looking at and at what altitudes. With a 200 horsepower version of each airplane, the SE-5A is faster than the SPAD by about 2 miles per hour down at low altitudes, but the SPAD is slightly faster at some higher altitudes. Overall, the SE-5A is about 2 miles per hour faster, not much. Both planes use the same engine, but the SE-5A probably has slightly less parasitic drag. I think that's due to the difference between the SPAD XIII's round bracing wires, of which there were a lot, and what the British were using. The SE-5A, as with other British fighters, used what they called RAF wire, which was a streamlined, not round wire, which gave them an aerodynamic advantage, which for some reason wasn't copied by SPAD or by the Germans, at least not during the war. The SPAD XIII's climb performance was decent. I shaded in its line on this chart to make it a bit easier to see. Although the SE-5A's climb performance is not on this chart, it is slightly behind the SPAD XIII's. Other than the engine, there isn't anything really special about the SPAD XIII. Its airframe is conventional for the time. Its two wings are of equal span and chord. The top wing is placed very close to the fuselage, and with a cutout above the pilot, these things improve visibility. It was just a well-built, well-designed airplane with no real faults and a great engine, and very often that's enough. I think the book Quest for Performance gives a great summary of the SPAD XIII, so I'll read it. Quote, although the SPAD XIII incorporated no new technical innovations, it synergistically combined an airframe of relatively high aerodynamic efficiency and great structural strength with an excellent engine to produce an outstanding aircraft. It may be regarded as representative of the top of the state-of-the-art of a 1918 fighter aircraft equipped with thin, strut-and-wire braced wings. The SPAD was so highly regarded that a number of countries maintained the aircraft as a part of their active Air Force inventory for several years following the war. A total of 8,472 SPAD XIII aircraft were manufactured. Unquote. That sums up the plane really well. There was nothing revolutionary here. It was the combination of a well-designed and rugged, but otherwise unremarkable airframe, combined with a great engine and good firepower that made the SPAD XIII the great airplane that it was. If you enjoyed this video, please consider joining my Patreon and like and subscribe. Also, I have more World War I aircraft videos you might enjoy. Just search through the channel page for more. That's all for now. Goodbye and have a great day.